The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GALA webinar series. My name is Manuela Noske, and I'm the Communications Manager at GALA. GALA is a global nonprofit trade association that enables communication and business across languages and cultures. We are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. And today we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Gregory Anderson from the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages. We're hosting this particular webinar in conjunction with International Translation Day, which will be celebrated on the 30th of September. This year, the theme of International Translation Day is Translation and Indigenous Languages. And for this occasion, we felt that it would be appropriate to talk about Indigenous languages and how they're faring at the moment. I will hand it over to our speaker in just a moment, but before I do that, as always, I have our housekeeping items to go over. Everyone's lines are muted to cut down on any noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, let me know by using your chat box, and I'll work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your phone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you will be able to find it following the presentation on GALA's global website. All participants will receive a link. If you have any questions or comments, please type them into your chat box. We will get to as many questions as we can with the time remaining after the presentation. Next, let me introduce Greg Anderson. Greg is the director of the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages. He specializes in the languages of Siberia and tribal languages of India. He has degrees in linguistics from Harvard and the University of Chicago and has conducted extensive fieldwork into the languages of the Altai-Siang group and among speakers of the Munda languages in India. He has published widely in the fields of historical linguistics, descriptive grammar, morphology, verb typology, and the linguistics of Munda, Salishan, and Ongonoid languages. And now, without any further ado, we have a full deck, so I will hand it over to Greg now.
Great, thank you, Manuela. So I wanted to, in light of this year's Year of the Indigenous Language, just give a kind of snapshot of the state of Indigenous languages around the world and frame that within the process of language endangerment, which many of these minority languages are facing today as their current reality and their future reality. So basically want to frame this in the context of various common questions that people typically ask me about languages and endangered languages, specifically in the state of Indigenous languages. So more or less framing this in a kind of question and answer session where I'm both posing the questions and answering them. So just want to get started now with this, and I'm going to advance the screen somehow. Let's see. There we go. Sorry about that. So the first question that people often ask when they realize you're a linguist is, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? This is probably the single most common question I get asked after how many languages do you speak? It's the normal question they first start with, but that's not relevant to this. So the next most common question I get asked is, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? And the two things that I say is, the things you have to remember is that everyone speaks a dialect. And that people basically only experience other people as having accents. I don't have an accent, you have an accent. So this is the two basic kind of personal ideologies that people are largely unaware. You speak a dialect and you have an accent. That's not something that most people are aware of about themselves, but that's just something that we need to know. But it still doesn't really answer the question, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? It's a very difficult question to answer. Uriel Weinreich, who was a sociolinguist active in the early part of the post-Chomskyan period in the 1960s and 70s, he had a quote, originally I believe it was in Yiddish, but translated into English here: a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement, but what it really means is that language as such, as we conceive of, is a social and political entity. And it therefore subsumes a number of varieties But the main variety that assumes power within a community is what gets called the language, and every other variety in that same community that diverges from that norm that's been established is going to be called a dialect. But it's really more of a distinction of sociology or politics than it is of linguistics per se. How one perceives varieties and assigns value judgments to them is a social phenomenon. The variation exists. The value judgments is a social or political phenomenon. So, how many of these languages are there? Again, a very difficult question to answer, although one frequently posed by people. And really, we don't really know is the actual answer. The estimates that have been thrown about in various professional literature would range around somewhere between 6,500 and 7,200. So as a rough estimate, we'll just say there's roughly 7,000 languages in the world. These, however, are not evenly distributed across the continents, nor are they evenly distributed across nation states or polities that exist today. And the consequences of that distribution has relevance to the state of these languages today in the modern world. So one of the things that we see very clearly is that not only geographically are these languages not consistently spread out, demographically they're not as well. So the vast majority of people speak one of, say, roughly 85, or let's be generous, say 100 languages in the world, and that accounts for 4/5 basically of the world's population. And conversely, roughly half of the world's languages are spoken by a total of just 0.1% of the world's languages. So it's pretty easy to see when we look at this kind of demographic split that there's going to be languages that are likely to be thriving and languages that are likely to be not thriving. And that's, of course, exactly what we find when we look at the distribution of the health of languages globally speaking. So I wanted to frame what's happening today in the historical context. So basically, there was a major population disruption that was set into motion roughly 500 years ago. Now, it's other things that have happened in past before that, but there was a significant redistribution of languages globally when the expansion out of Europe came. And as a result, there was both the expansion of European languages to new areas, which displaced indigenous languages in many of those areas. There were also the creation of a small number of new languages, that is, various mixed languages, sometimes under the rubric of creoles. It's a separate type of mixed language, but that's the most common type of mixed type of language that we see when we have contact between differential power groups speaking different languages, so a more powerful and less powerful group. When you have a demographic skewing towards the least powerful group with non-complete access to the more powerful group's language, the language like Creole languages are likely to get developed in such a context. Another consequence of this type of language context is heavy restructuring of the languages. So they've shifted many of their structures, borrowing a lot of words, a lot of grammar even, and so reorganizing their languages based on the model of the superordinate, socially dominant language. But I do want to point out here that when I'm talking about a colonialist legacy for indigenous languages in the 21st century, I'm not only talking about your standard type of colonialist practice where Europeans got on ships, sailed across an ocean, and imposed a new Europe, so to speak, on indigenous communities. I'm also talking about processes today in the 20th and 21st century that we could call internal neo-colonialist practices by nation states with respect to their minority communities. So it is not solely the purview of Europeans and post-European polities like the United States or Australia that have language endangerment issues, but we see these issues manifested in different ways due to the different social and historical contexts of the different communities and nation states that exist today. But the practice of nation states who aren't typically associated with colonialist history or colonialist practice today doesn't really differ in a substantial way than the colonialist practices of the standard understanding of colonialism that most people bring to the table when they hear that. So just wanted to reiterate the fact that we have internal neo-colonialist issues which are strongly parallel to your kind of traditional colonialist practices in terms of the linguistic outcomes with respect to endangerment of languages. So language endangerment is a global issue. It has local manifestations, and it's a much more severe situation than most people are aware. So we're aware of biodiversity crises, loss of species of various domains, fish, plants, birds, mammals. But languages are significantly more endangered as a whole, statistically speaking, than any of those other biological extinction events are relevant to their domain. So languages, a conservative estimate is 40% of the world's languages are endangered right now. It's probably actually higher than that because there's a lot of reasons that people claim they speak languages when they don't, and other things. There's a heritage identity phenomenon going on that's not necessarily linguistic competence. So in my own surveys around the world, I find that the languages are often worse off than has been reported in the literature. So I am more in the camp that thinks that we're over 50% for sure, and it's possibly as high as 70% of the world's languages right now. Now, what is an endangered language? It's a very common question that one gets. There is a technical definition for that. People use different terms for this and different criteria for determining it, but what I believe that you can say very distinctly as an endangered language is when intergenerational transmission has been disrupted. So when children are not learning the language as a first language, or they stop using the heritage language when they enter school. This is another very common phenomenon. So they speak the language, their parents speak to them, but they reject that language once they enter a peer set sensitive context like schooling. And that's when we can consider languages to be endangered, when children no longer use the language. It's almost a inevitability that once the children start learning the language, stop learning the language, that they will not be able to pass it on to their children logically, and then a couple of generations pass, the language is gone. So a little bit more on language endangerment. Why? Why do languages become endangered? Well, this is a very complicated question, and one that it does not have a simple or short answer. Basically, if you want to summarize what the reasons that languages become endangered are, is that there is a set of psychosocial factors that people have assigned various values or various emotional, positive or negative responses to identity and the use of a language. And this is often framed in the context of their usefulness or their use in a modern culture. And when viewed from the already power in unequal situation of the dominant language and minority languages, you're never going to have a scenario where the minority languages are going to be considered as useful or more useful than the majority language. So this is a kind of a majority language ideology that's being internalized by speakers of minority languages. So basically, language endangerment is caused by a conflict in language ideologies. That is, the ideology that says a socially dominant language is inherently superior to the languages it's in a power differential with, and thus, by extension, that the languages that are lower status are in fact low quality languages, low value languages, and thus, as a vector of discrimination, speakers logically find ways to abandon them. So it basically devalues multilingualism. It asserts an ideology of what we call subtractive monolingualism rather than additive multilingualism or additive bilingualism. So we as linguists who work on endangered languages, well, we like numbers and we like categories. So we want to categorize the different types of endangered languages into different scales or degrees of endangerment. And this is the one that we use at Living Tongues Institute. Different scholars have their own perspective on this, but the one that we use basically ranges from healthy or stable or expanding down to extinct. And the various gradations that we recognized are threatened, locally endangered, endangered, locally seriously endangered, or moribund, seriously endangered, and moribund. So I will describe now what each of those terms roughly means. So a threatened language is a language where the ecological or demographic factors are favorable for shift. the shift hasn't started yet, but the circumstances based on other situations that we've seen that other languages are in are either socially, that is ecologically conducive to languages being abandoned, or the community is just so small that by definition a single act of nature or something could wipe out that community. That for a language like Indonesian or Mandarin or French, that's impossible to imagine, of course, because the speaker base is so large. But for a language that's localized to a specific village or a set of villages, a single event can, in fact, wipe out entire language communities, as happened one day in 1995 on the north coast of New Guinea, where 4 language communities that were previously healthy or stable, but demographically threatened, were wiped out overnight by a tsunami. So that's a reality for small language communities, and not something that anyone imagines for the major language communities. So locally endangered basically means shifts happen in some places, not in others. Endangered, children are not learning the language, as I said, so the youngest speakers are basically parental age. Seriously endangered or locally seriously endangered, this means the youngest speakers essentially are grandparent age, so 2 generations from the current learners. And moribund basically is a language where you have only extremely elderly speakers who are at the great grandparental age, and it's effectively a language it's waiting for its last speakers to die, and then it would be called extinct. There are other metaphors people use, such as sleeping and dormant. I personally feel those kind of denigrate the seriousness of the issue. It's not really just like shaking a language awake. It takes a little more effort than that to get a language that has no speakers to be used again. Okay, so how many endangered languages are there? Again, we don't know how many languages there are, so you can't give a specific number. This is just one count that we have right now in our reckoning, and this will change because as we get new data from colleagues out in the fields, we have to revise these numbers. But roughly speaking, we'll see that this is the distribution of these languages. Fortunately, almost 1/3 of these are still only threatened, and thus can be have measures taken that might support their use. So a threatened language has a really strong chance of being able to endure as long as it has the right type of support, and as long as the ecological factors that have been contributing to its threat are addressed. Moribund languages, this is a situation where even the greatest efforts by linguists and the communities, which is the most important, of course, people, they're the only ones who can save their languages, they're unlikely to work. Now, that's not something you want to discuss with people who speak moribund languages. You want to be encouraging, but realistically, we know that those are languages that are unlikely to be able to be resurrected or brought back into some kind of functional domains. Okay, well, you might be asking yourself, why should I care? Well, you're a language professional, so you should love this, to celebrate the diversity of language, of course. And every language definitely has the same value to its community of speakers as an emblem of ethnic identity as any other language does. So there's no lesser value of a language of 500 people than there is for one of 500 million people. It's still a significant emblem of identity, and it's also very much so a storehouse of community history. And as communities, they have the moral right to keep these languages. They are, all things being equal, people choose to keep their language. They don't choose to abandon them. They would choose to add languages to their repertoire, but they don't choose to abandon them in the favor of another one. That is because they have internalized a negative value of that language with respect to the socially dominant language. So of course, as a linguist, I'm interested in what languages of these type can help us understand about the nature of language and the nature of the human mind and advance linguistics as a science. And given this reality, that languages should be maintained and that they offer challenging insights into linguistics and the nature of cognition, among other things, and the reality that not only are most languages, but even more severely, most language families are endangered and are likely to disappear. And then we'll be left with a very small number of language families with a number of languages in them. this means that we must direct our research efforts towards these languages in the coming decade. So other reasons that you might offer to somebody, well, there's economic reasons. It's very clear from longitudinal studies done in both Canada and in the United States that multilingual communities have both on average 4.5 years of longer for the onset of dementia in bilingual speakers than in monolinguals. And in immersion schools in the United States for indigenous communities, like, for example, Cherokee in Oklahoma, you find significant trends towards higher salaries, greater rate of employment, lower incarceration rates, lower drug and alcohol abuse rates amongst the students that went through the immersion program, who've had instilled in them a sense of ethnic pride, or at least not instilled in them a sense of ethnic shame, that this has allowed them to excel as people in a society, which benefits everybody. So there's a huge number of reasons why to do it, and there's really only one not to, because you don't like multilingualism. So it's basically just a bias, and that's not something that in today's world that we can tolerate. So why now? Well, the 21st century has offered technological advancements that have leveled the playing field in a way never before imaginable. And also, we're dealing with a demographic reality that many of the people who are elderly and speaking these languages are passing on. And with them, they are taking an enormous storehouse of information of all kinds of different unrelated domains. And so this is something that we know does not translate across languages, and this is knowledge simply that's going to be lost if we don't do something about it now. Okay, so where are these endangered languages concentrated? Well, they're basically concentrated in areas where you have different types of colonialist practice. So to bring it back to the colonialism, where we find the most severe language endangerment is where we had former settlement colonies. So places where the goal of the newcomers was to take over the land, create new, better Europes, if you will. And so places like Australia, North America, most of Southern South America, and Siberia are all extreme instances of settlement colonies where the majority population was set on replacing the indigenous minority communities and languages. There are also other different types of colonial practices that yield other types of language endangerment. I'll talk about those in a second. So where we find language endangerment localized, as I mentioned, regardless of the specifics of the situation, are where these ecologies, the social ecologies favor that. So the social ecology is a set of parameters that involve the social attitudes, language policies from the government, educational policies, access to media, all of these different things that are indicative of the health or vitality or usability, to use that term, of a language in different contexts. So the ecological health, if you will, in a social, political landscape is what determines whether a language is likely to endure or not, or whether it's likely to be endangered. Now, as it turns out, because of these historical circumstances, there are concentrations in specific places. And so a few years ago, I put forth this view, this theory of areas to focus in the world where we find these concentrations of endangered languages, of low documentation and of high levels of diversity. That are the areas, those are the areas that we must focus on. And these areas I've called the language hotspots. So just to recap what a language hotspot is, it's an area where you have a high average level of endangerment, a low average level of documentation of the languages, and a high density of what linguists call a phylogenetic linguistic diversity. So that is diversity at the level of language family. And the language family that we're talking about here is more like Romance or Germanic or Slavic as opposed to Indo-European. So Germanic languages share a certain commonality, Romance languages share a certain commonality, Slavic languages too, amongst themselves. And yes, we know that those three groups are all related to each other at the Indo-European level, again, removed a couple of thousand years from the level at which Germanic, Romance, or Slavic were one community. It's that level of Germanic and Slavic and Romance where you see a kind of language family signature. And thus that's kind of the level at which linguists who work in the field called typology look at different types of language. That's the level that they sample at. So you want to make sure that you have not just one Indo-European language, because that's going to be too few Indo-European languages, but one Romance language, one Germanic language, if you're trying to do a comprehensive survey at that phylogenetic level. So that's the level that we're talking about here. Now, if we look at the distribution of language endangerment and the global language hotspots, we'll see this is roughly what we find. The areas that are not colored on this map are areas where you find basically single dominant languages having spread to the exclusion of all other languages in the area. So that would be basically northern China, the northern half of Africa, most of the New World, whether it's Spanish, Portuguese, or English. Now, this map makes the native languages of the Americas look a little more widespread than they really are, but bear with me. Now, when we look at the degree of endangerment across these language hotspots, we'll see that there is actually very strong areal skewing in this too. So the way to interpret this map is red means really endangered, green means not so endangered or threatened. So we very clearly see the consequences of the settlement colonies here in Australia, the northern and southern parts of South America, United States, and in Siberia. These are the areas where we find near total replacement of the indigenous languages with the socially dominant language of the nation state language in these countries. So in North Africa, of course, it's tied to the spread of Islam and the spread of Arabic there. But otherwise, it's largely with the expansion of specific post-colonial states. So, but you can really see the difference between the settlement colonies and the trade and exploitation colonies, where you find a higher concentration of languages still thriving. So basically, there's three different types of ecologies that are relevant around the world. One I've just mentioned, that's the settlement colonialism. The other one is the national identity construction and internal neocolonialism. And then the third category is the trade and exploitation colonies. So briefly on the settlement colonialism, I'm just going to talk about Siberia a little bit. So in Siberia, we find this hierarchy of languages. So Russian is the very top. And then we have various gradations of indigenous languages. And the gradations there are the bigger ones that have writing, the medium-sized ones that were given writing by the Soviets, but no one uses the writing system. Then the recently re-recognized or recognized languages, so languages that have previously been declassified in the case of Chulim or not recognized in the case of Telu, and then languages which still remain unrecognized, like Khizil. So this is sort of the hierarchy of languages that you see, and this correlates precisely to the degree of endangerment that we see in these languages. Languages like Chulim and Khizil are nearly extinct. Languages like Yakut and Tuvan are doing pretty well. So obviously, at the time of Russian contact, this was a non-Russian speaking area, and there were roughly 10 different language families spoken in Siberia. But the legacy of exploitation, environmental degradation, clear cutting, and the like has left the land scarred and the communities devastated. So today, unlike that original 17th century map, we primarily find Siberian indigenous languages localized to single villages. This map, using a dot and not a polygon to represent the languages, is a much more accurate representation of the spread of languages we find today in Siberia. The area I've worked in mainly is down here in the southwestern part of Siberia, although I have visited communities in other parts of Siberia. And specifically working with the Altai Sayan Turkic group. Here I'm working with Vasya Gabov, who's the youngest and last, in fact, he's the last remaining speaker of Chulim Turkic, the second to last speaker, died a few months ago. So he is now a speech community of one. So it's a very strong need to help Vastid document his language and his knowledge before he passes on himself. Turning now to the other type of internal neo-colonialist practice, this is something that we find very commonly in Asian polities and also in Eastern Africa. I'm going to focus on the Asian areas here for now. So throughout Southeast Asia, we find a hierarchy of ethnicities codified, usually in the form of so-called official minorities or recognized minorities versus the realities of the linguistic diversity that exists in the country. There's very much so never a one-to-one correlation between the actual number of languages spoken in these countries and the reckoning of so-called official ethnic minorities. So China, probably one of the most extreme, has 54 official ethnic minorities, but over 250 languages. We don't really know how many. Vietnam is heavily influenced by Chinese in its official policy, and thus it correlates very closely with its 53 official ethnic minorities. Some countries, like Cambodia, don't really recognize officially any minorities, but there's at least 24 languages spoken that are not Khmer in that country. So we find this inherent codification of hierarchies of different communities, community identities, and specifically languages subsumed under those official communities. So we're talking about this part of the world. We see it's a highly dense area linguistically, lots and lots of languages belonging to several different families and various other small groups, isolates, creoles, and such. So typically what we find in Southeast Asia, and I'm including China here, is a hierarchy of languages that involves the national state language, and then the so-called large official ethnic minorities, and the smaller official ethnic minorities, and then the sort of invisible, unofficial ethnic minority languages. So the unofficial, this fourth level is pretty much invisible to the majority population. They aren't even aware they exist for the most part. They're just the Yi or whatever ethnicity. It doesn't matter if they speak 18 different languages. Here we find an interesting phenomena where the more hill or vertical, higher up in the mountains of communities, the more devalued its language and identity is going to be. Throughout these kind of internal neo-colonialist polities, what we're finding is their goal is basically suppress identity, suppress minorities, except for when they can run them out for either tourism or state purposes of showing how inclusive the state is. As long as they put away their tribal attire and go back to living the life of a normal low-income person in their country, as soon as that state-sanctioned display of ethnicity is over. So this is the reality that we find throughout this part of the world. So what we do see from the state in these places is a very common set of phenomena where they infantilize the minority communities. They're often depicted as children, and in the metaphors, it's the paternalistic state that's helping these children through development into the modern world. There's overt sexualization of these communities, so you often find women only in these displays of brochures, for example, for ecotourist things. The dehistoricization is this: they want to freeze them in this particular frame only when that serves the state purposes for showing how good they are to their citizenry or how tolerant or whatever the state purpose is. So we see this in official products coming out of these countries. So this is one not great to see, but it basically represents the minority peoples as children to be taught how to behave by the paternalistic state. This is a ecotourist thing from Lao. Apparently there are no men in Lao Hill tribe communities. In the Western Pacific, we have a slightly different permutation on this theme. Rather than there being a ethnic group whose language is the state language, like Thai or Vietnamese, in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, we find a kind of de-ethnicized national language created that's then promoted vigorously. And then we also find various regionally dominant languages that are pretty large, and then various smaller languages down the line. In both Indonesia and the Philippines, the more, again, like Southeast Asia, the more hill, the more remote, the more rural, the more peripheral, the darker the speaker community is in terms of their skin tone. These all are vectors of the bias and the hierarchy. So in the Philippines, we have Filipino, and then we have these 8 large languages, and then these local ethnic languages. At the very bottom, though, we have the Negrito post-forager speech communities, who are darker skinned than the typical Filipino populations. In the Philippines, there's also a Christian, non-Christian hierarchy. So if the community's Christian, its language is likely to be more valued than the non-Christian one. Similar to Indonesia, except for that the religious hierarchy has Muslim above Christian in Indonesia, but again ranks these Austronesian or more East Asian looking phenotypes over the Papuan or more darker skinned phenotypes. And again, Bahasa Indonesia is effectively a rebranded ethnic language that was de-ethnicized. But it's promoted aggressively as the national identity now. Now we see the endangerment change really at work in a place like Indonesia. So Wayan Arka did this wonderful study where he showed how languages of the 4th rank shift to the 3rd rank languages. The 3rd rank languages in turn are shifting to their next higher up, these regionally dominant languages. In turn, those speakers themselves are shifting towards the national language. So we're seeing this chain of hierarchy of shifts. India, possibly the most hierarchical nation state linguistically and socially, arguably, in many countries, certainly in Asia. Here we find up to 7 different levels of hierarchies of language, starting with, in northern India here I'm talking about, because I've been working mainly in northern and central India, not southern India, where things are different. So not in the Dravidian part of the world, but in the Hindi sphere here. We have the transnational Indian English. We have the national language, which is, whether Oriya or Bengali speakers like it, is now increasingly Hindi. Then we have these state level official languages like Odia in Orissa and Bengali in West Bengal. And then there are the so-called local Indo-Aryan lingua francas, Desia in southern Odisha, and in Jharkhand, Sadani or Sadri. There are sort of tribal forms of Hindi or Oriya. And then you have the so-called scheduled tribal languages, of which there's one, Santali in the Munda world. And then we have the so-called literate tribal languages, languages for which there are writing systems. And then we have the so-called illiterate, also known as primitive and backwards, up till 2013, when that term was officially rebranded particularly vulnerable. So you can see if they're a community called primitive and backwards, they're unlikely to be highly valued by people who are associated themselves with say the national language. Okay, so this is an inherently discriminatory term. Just to show you what part of the world we're operating in here, this is the Indian subcontinent language hotspot. Okay, lastly, talking about the 3rd type, the trade and exploitation colonies. Here we find the rise of middleman languages or Creole languages. So this is a typical situation that you find across Equatorial Africa. There's a triglossic situation. So you have the former colonial language, typically English or French, often, which has the highest status in these communities and the official status, and is used by elites in the community to signal their dominance in interethnic communication. But there's also typically a market language or another language, which is a sort of locally dominant language or regionally dominant language. That may be a Creole variety, or it may be a indigenous language that happened to ascend to that state when it was in the colonial period. And then you have the local, like, village languages. So triglossic, often people have 3 languages and need to be able to use them in different communicative contexts. The one they may not have is this official language, and they're often the access to that is only through education. And then if they go through education, they might become civil servants, etc. So as you move up socially, you get more access to those higher languages. And in a place like India, as I just mentioned, the people who, like the Birhor people who are at the very bottom, can never aspire to even Hindi or English. They can only aspire to something higher up in the middle of that hierarchy, because those hierarchies kind of determine how far up the linguistic chain you're permitted to go. So in Melanesia, we basically find a similar thing. So like Papua New Guinea, but there, or Vanuatu, Solomon Islands. But here we're finding the rise of Creole languages rather than middleman languages that happen to be enfranchised during the colonies period. So a little bit about Equatorial Africa. Here you see it's highly dense in the Nigeria, Cameroon area. Huge number of languages this area. This is by language family, broadly speaking. Now, an example of 3 regional dominant languages ascending in a country that has an official language, which is a colonialist language, Nigeria, where English is the official language. We also find Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo having asserted themselves regionally in the areas here in the southwest, southeast, and north. And we also have pidgin varieties or creolized forms of English that are used in various other places. So the kind of full range of that is expressed in Nigeria. Okay, so what can we do? Well, we document these languages. And what linguists mean by a language documentation is that it has a way to be written. In that writing system, whether it's phonetic or community-based system, you want to produce a grammar. So something that describes the grammar of the language, some kind of dictionary, a storehouse of words, and a collection of texts that we gloss. This is a linguistic term that we put various code that linguists read to how to analyze the words. And then today we also have to include an annotated digital searchable corpus of audio video materials that can be accessed by researchers from around the world. Citizen science is something that we've been promoting at Living Tongues because we're dealing with the situation where there's a huge amount of languages, a huge amount of effort to be done, and very few linguists that can really help out in this. So we've been trying to find ways to leverage citizens who are actively engaged in maintaining their linguistic identity to help in this way. And one of the things that we've been working on, and we're in the beta testing phase right now, but it is available to people at this URL, talkingdictionaries.app, it is an ability to create a multimedia online, mobile-friendly, mobile creatable, mobile deliverable dictionary for citizens of different parts of the world. And so we're busy working on that. And I encourage anyone here to get involved with that if they'd like and test it out themselves, because it doesn't have to be endangered languages. It doesn't have to be indigenous languages even. Any language should have a talking dictionary, and this app allows that to happen now. Why a talking dictionary? Well, this is the moment when I realized we needed a talking dictionary. So my colleague David Harrison and I had produced a dictionary of the Tuvan language, and we were giving it out in encampments across Tuva and Mongolia. And these ladies opened it to page 1 and said, "You're missing words," which of course we were. And but we realized, oh my gosh, we can't really do anything about that, can we? So we decided that was the point that we needed to build a online updatable multimedia dictionary of the Tuvan language. And that was the first impetus for creating the talking dictionaries that we now have over 100 languages in. So basically, a talking dictionary has this orthography, but it also has a writing system that has a way to hear the language. They're never out of print. They're fun to use. Languages can be, people can make their own village variety, whatever. It's sort of it's taking citizen science to the next level. So we've run various workshops for language activists with talking dictionaries around the world. This is one from India in 2011. It's from Latin American participants in Chile. This one was in Micronesia. This is Zimbabwe. This one was in Papua New Guinea. This is me working with Alfred Bud Lane of the Siletz Deni community, and he was a major spearhead in developing one of the first online talking dictionary resources for a Native American community here based in Oregon, where Living Tongues is. This was his motivation for doing so. He knew the language was in serious decline, and that what they had done before wasn't adequate. So this was how he described why he felt the language was important, and as a recognition of what he was going to do. This is what the Silet's Deni Talking Dictionary looks like. I don't know if this will work, but I'll try.
Acorn sifter basket.
So that is what this language sounds like.
File.
Unlike other talking dictionaries, we have the English in this one because of the fact that he is the only current competent speaker of the language. And if he dies, we wanted to make sure we had all of them tied together. We've done this around the world. I mentioned Nigeria earlier. My colleague, Bolanle Orokoyo, has worked extensively on this Olokumi talking dictionary. It's the first ever presence of Olokumi community online. And lastly, just wanted to say what we have been doing at Living Tongues Institute for the last few years, which is we've been spearheading a collaborative development program with the Munda language communities in Jharkhand and Orissa. And as a result, we've been developing all kinds of materials in the languages, scientific, linguist-oriented ones, and community use ones as well. And I just wanted to share some of the people who've been taking part in this. We have Madhuri and Kameshwar Birhor up in the left-hand corner, Birhor language activists, and Tankadar and Kamla Sisa here, who are Told language activists. We have Gayatri and Sanda Sardar, they're Bhumij language activists here. Paulo and Rinki Purti, some Ho language activists. With Sonia and Sukari Dangaramaji, who are Remo activists, and Budra Raspada, their Gata talking dictionary originator. This is my colleague at Living Tongues of Pino Gamongo. He's a speaker of Sora. He's worked extensively on a number of Munda languages. And also, lastly, Dr. Bikram Jora, the only current living speaker of a Munda language with a PhD in linguistics. There was a scholar who died a few years ago who had one prior. So that is a snapshot from the world of endangered languages and the current state of Indigenous languages as we celebrate linguistic diversity in this year of Indigenous language. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg, for giving us an overview, but also talking us through the talking dictionary and how it works. I want to open up the floor for questions. We have just about 10 minutes left. So if you guys have on the call have any questions, go ahead. But let me kick it off with something, and I'll be provocative. You know my feeling about endangered languages, but let me be provocative and say, if communities are ready to let go of their languages for economic or other reasons, why not let go?
Right, it's an excellent question. And from the community perspective, you absolutely need to respect that. And even if you don't like what led them to that, because it's more of a gun to the head economics decision than it is a free market economics decision. But the reality, well, from my perspective there, as a linguist who works with endangered languages, we have a dual purpose of our obligations. One is to the community itself, okay? And the community has the right to change, modify, abandon, whatever they want with their language. The other obligation, however, is to the community of future scientists of linguistics. And in that case, we at least want to document the language for our own, albeit selfish, intellectual purposes. But we feel like the benefit potentially down the line to humanity for insights that we may gain from these languages is worth at least documenting them, even if the community themselves doesn't want them anymore.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just an obligation towards future generation of linguists, but future generations of humanity, right? Who would
Correct.
Otherwise lose the data that you and other people are currently collecting that might lead to new insights right. At some point down the road.
Exactly. It would be insane to think that we've thought of every possible use of this data in the future. Okay, of course, there are things that haven't even been invented yet that it could be used for. But if it's not recorded, it's not useful for anything.
Mm-hmm. There are a number of efforts ongoing. Some are driven by the communities themselves. Some are driven through, collaboration with academia. Some are of a more humanitarian nature of trying to stem this language loss. What efforts have you seen that you think may really bear fruit? Is there anything that you could call out, or what that gives you hope, like, yeah, I think this is the right approach and this could actually work as a model for others?
I think that, first of all, children are the key, because children are taught biases, and if you teach them the right message, then they're not going to have those attitudes that the older people in their community may have deeply ingrained. So I just anecdotally, I feel like characters like Dora the Explorer have done a lot to help tolerance towards Spanish bilingualism in the United States amongst young people. Obviously, there are young people that don't agree with that, but on average, you have a higher tolerance in this current generation of younger people to that type of someone being able to use Spanish or English in different contexts, and that not being like a sign that they're somehow untrustworthy or something, which I think a lot of older people, whether they articulate it that or not, they feel that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that media through and education through to children is what will change societal attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need to do.
Okay. The audience today are people who are, we call them broadly language professionals, people who work in the translation industry, in the localization industry, and it's a multi-billion-dollar business annually. They often come out of the humanities or with a background in the humanities, often with a background in languages, but they may not be speakers of any sort of one of the smaller languages. What can, if you think about it, what can people who work in the language industry do to help, raise the status of some of these smaller or lesser spoken languages?
Right. Okay. I think that's a great question. And I feel if we are looking at the languages that are on the healthier end of the endangerment scale, virtually any interventionist methods, even developing software tools for the language, in a way validates it for its speakers. So I think that there's a lot that can be done in the groups that are, say, in the threatened category, or small demographically threatened, or large languages that are ecologically threatened. So I think that there's a significant amount of effort that could be done. Realistically, when we're looking at the more extreme forms of endangerment, there's not much anyone can do other than document, and certainly that should be the purview of linguists. But I think language professionals have a strong role to play in finding ways to have outlets for the use of these, whether it's media, whether it's education, whether it's technology, that for these languages for which that type of interventionist methods would probably really help bolster and support their status and state for the future.
I agree. And I think minimally, we should expect everybody working in this industry to be curious about these languages, right? And aware of what's going on, and not stick our heads in the sand and, pretend that this isn't happening. Language loss is very, very real.
Right. And it's psychologically traumatic for people too. That's the thing, is that we have to be aware that there are consequences to your general well-being that you may not be aware of, just by having people who are, not in the best state they can be in your community.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we had for today. So I think we're going to call it quits. Greg, a really big thank you to you for taking the time and educating us today about the state of Indigenous languages. And another big thank you to all of our audience for joining us. We would really appreciate it if you could take just a minute to give us your feedback on today's session using the post-event survey. It will pop right up after we close. It is short, but your perspectives help us to continue to refine our webinar program. And with that, I wish you a good day, Greg, because I know you're in Oregon. I wish many of you a good night, and I look forward to seeing you at another GALA webinar soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.